Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Yolanda Pierce. Dr. Pierce is a scholar, writer, womanist theologian, and accomplished administrator in higher education. She currently serves as professor and dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School. Yolanda's research specialties include literature and religion, womanist theology, and African American religions. A widely published author, she's written several books, essays, and articles for academic and trade journals, including Time Magazine, The Christian Century, Theology Today, and Christianity and Literature. Yolanda's newest book is The Wounds Are the Witness, Black Faith Weaving Memory into Justice and Healing with Broadleaf Books. Her previous books include In My Grandmother's House, Black Women, Faith, and the Stories We Inherit that we discussed a couple of years ago, and Hell Without Fires, Slavery, Christianity, and the Antebellum Spiritual Narrative. Yolanda also wrote the foreword to the re-release of Howard Thurman's Meditations of the Heart. Dr. Pierce is the creator and curator of Touching the Sacred, an exhibit on material religion in the Black Church. She's also been the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Pew Foundation, and the 2023 Martin E. Marty Award for the Public Understanding of Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Yolanda previously served as professor and dean at Howard University's Divinity School and was the founding director of the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Yolanda and I first collaborated when she was at Princeton Theological Seminary and spoke at one of the writers' conferences that I produced there a few years ago now. You can learn more at yolandapierce.com and broadleafbooks.com. So Yolanda, it's so wonderful to see you again, and many congratulations on all of your wonderful work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Certainly, certainly. Anything else you'd like people to know about you?
No, that was a pretty extensive bio. Thank you.
And how are you liking Nashville so far?
So far so good. I'm a native New Yorker and I've spent the vast majority of my life in the Northeast and moved here most recently from Washington, D.C. So still learning Nashville, still learning Southern culture. I'm having a good time.
And how's Vanderbilt?
Vanderbilt is wonderful. It's a wonderful university. The Divinity School is just a great place. And, we're just all dealing with lots of different changes and challenges in higher education these days.
Yes.
Never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment, and getting less dull by the
Yeah.
moment, I would say. So let's get into the book. As I mentioned, The Wounds Are the Witness, Black Faith Weaving Memory into Justice and Healing. How did this is kind of a unique book. How did it come about?
It really comes about from a careful reading of the idea of Thomas, this doubting disciple.
Hmm.
So all my life, I've heard sermons about the disciple who needed to see the wounds of Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, to know for himself that that is Jesus, right? And
Hmm.
and so I had heard sermon after sermon. Most of those sermons focused on the question of doubt and belief, right? He has doubts. He can only believe if he touches. What do we do with the people who can't touch but believe, right? And so many of those sermons focused on this question of doubt and belief. And that's certainly a part of faith. And I talk quite a bit in my other work about doubt and belief. But for me, the crux of the story is not that at all. The idea that after this passion of Christ, what we call the passion of Christ, this crucifixion, this gruesome scene, this glorious resurrection, that Jesus chooses to appear to his disciple and then others with the wounds still evident. And so for me, the story is about the wounds, right? What does it mean for this Jesus, this person that Christians affirm as the Christ, as the Son of God? What does it mean to appear where the wounds in the flesh, the physical, tangible evidence is still present for them to see? And so for me, I write about the wounds are the witness as to talk about the wounds that we receive. Sometimes they're physical, sometimes they leave scars, sometimes the wounds come from people we love or come from strangers. Sometimes the wounds are national, right? Sometimes the nation or the institutions we love inflict wounds. But how do we talk about wounds? And then how do we talk about healing? So all of this is to say, I was inspired not by the interplay between faith and doubt, but by this radical posture of vulnerability, of showing up to the disciples with the wounds still visible. And what do we do with that? And my ultimate conclusion is simply this: healing takes time. If even the resurrected Jesus still had wounds, then healing for the rest of us in the fullness of our humanity, it will take time.
Wow, that's very cool that you thought of it that way. The book title is so fitting because each chapter of the book, is based on some type of wound and its impact. So, can you tell us how you chose that organization, that theme, and then implement it?
Yes. And so that's what made me think about all of the different ways that we can talk about wounds and also the ways that we often don't discuss them. And so if you say wounds to someone in the healthcare profession, right, they're thinking about those physical, tangible, things that happen to the body. You can have a paper cut or you can have a gunshot wound, right? Like, so there's wounds in the medical context. But I was thinking about it more metaphorically. I was thinking about the harm that can be done to people by places or those you love or family members or institutions. But I'm also thinking about the wounds of the nation, like literally the wounds that the earth has received because of our carelessness, that we don't take care of the environment. And so, there's a scripture that talks about creation groaning, right? So there are wounds that are evident literally on our planet. And then I was thinking about, of course, the wounds that we bear in our spirit when we've been harmed. And so as a person of African descent, as a person of whose enslaved ancestors helped to build this country, I think about the wounds that come about because of racism or sexism or misogyny, right? So it's all of these different kinds of wounds. What are the possibilities for healing? How do those different wounds manifest themselves? Clearly, environmental wounds and damage to the earth, the scarring of the earth, the fracking, the mountaintop removal, the exploitation of the soil. That's a wound. And even though it's done to the earth and the planet, it still has implications to wound people, right? And so I'm just thinking about the interplay of all of these different wounds and scars and injuries, both visible and invisible, both tangible and intangible. And how do we heal from them? And where does God's justice show up as we look for healing?
Well, I love the way that you kind of took these things on a national or global, nature. I think that's an important thing, even more so in our society today.
Absolutely.
Um, the first chapter of your book talks about bones, so wounded remains, and you describe two different burial grounds, one in Portugal and one in New York City. And, they're pretty compelling descriptions. Can you just share a little bit about those two instances?
So I'm thinking about actual bones, like physical bones
Yeah.
in that chapter. And there is a field of study that is osteobiography, right? Which is you can tell a person's life story through a careful examination of bones, right? The remains, sometimes the remains hundreds and hundreds of years after the fact. And so I started with this idea by the poet Lucille Clifton, where she talked about a bridge of ivory. And what this bridge of ivory is that she's thinking about the transatlantic slave trade. And she's thinking about those who were pushed overboard or thrown overboard or those who chose to jump overboard. And to say that the Atlantic Ocean is this watery grave, like this place where the bones of people of African descent are littered as a response to the transatlantic slave trade. And so the two burial sites that I mentioned, one in Portugal and then one in New York, are burial sites in which the bones of enslaved African people have been discovered. And the bones tell the story of the trauma and the wounds. The bones tell us about the malnutrition. The bones tell us about the kind of physical labor that these folks perform. The bones tell us that in some instances, they were actually physically worked to death, right? And so the bones are telling a story. Instead of, I argue, saying, well, here are these bones. What can we do with these bones? What can we do with these stories? We actually have a responsibility, like the descendants of Joseph in the biblical text, to carry those bones, right? To actually put flesh back on those bones by remembering the stories, remembering the peoples, remembering the languages that are connected to these bones. And so we can tell the story through the bones, but healing comes through the remembering, the memory, putting like life, breathing life back, that valley of dry bones, right? Breathing a certain kind of life back into these bones. So we tell the story, and then the story of our nation is correctly told, because the story of our nation has everything to do with genocide and enslavement. And without those bones and letting them bear witness and the wounds that those bones represent, we're not telling a full picture of how we got to be who we are.
Well, thank goodness for books like yours, because I personally have learned so much history that I never knew before, by reading your books and, books by Indigenous authors and other Black authors. So thank you for, the work that it takes to uncover the bones, so to speak.
Absolutely. Excavation work. That's exactly what it is.
Yes, exactly. So the second chapter talks about wounds of shame. And a really poignant question that you ask is, what does hope look like when white supremacy has you feeling ashamed of being abused instead of angry at your abusers? That's such a, um, I don't know, terrible outcome, obviously. But, what advice are you giving folks?
So, I think about this because, of course, it seems counterintuitive when we say it out loud. Why should the victim bear the shame? That's often the case. We see examples in domestic and personal violence and interpartner violence, that it's often the victim who feels ashamed that somehow he or she did something wrong to cause someone else to abuse them. In the case I'm using there in that particular chapter, I'm talking about racism and police brutality and the victims of that somehow feeling ashamed, being made to feel ashamed of their bodies or being present or being Black, right? And so I'm really grappling with this notion of the harm that shame does to us. Shame is a silencing mechanism. And so part of, right, strategies to silence people is to make them feel ashamed, that somehow should you be ashamed of being a person who is descended from slavery? Should you be ashamed of poverty? Should you be ashamed of your ancestors or your forebears? So again, part of this is to speak the necessity toward healing, of letting go of some of that shame and allowing, even if the situation is horrific, in the case of abuse, in the case of neglect, in the case of the horrors and the terrors of racism, that it operates in the dark because of the shame. And so shedding light on it and allowing yourself to say, I won't hold that in my body, right? I won't hold that shame in my body. I won't hold the way that we still do the black-white binary where blackness and darkness is bad and evil and lightness and whiteness is good and evil. And we internalize that. So we're really talking about people and we're talking about flesh and we're talking about skin. And to say, I won't internalize that kind of shame that's put on me from these forces, particularly these binary forces. But it's actually a very difficult thing to do. And I think many people walk around with a great deal of shame, but I don't believe that that is God's will for us, right? And so how we let go of that shame so that we can really walk in the fullness of the healing that is available to us.
Amen. Um, uh, Another story that Shell I really got a kick out of was your heavy bag that you carried around for years. Maybe you still do, I don't know. But you talk about how that's relevant in this context.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm the person who likes to be prepared, right? And so for years, really starting with college and then definitely in graduate school, I had my laptop, I had books, I had a notebook, I had a journal, I had lunch, I had a water bottle, I mean, my bag probably, if I were to weigh it, would be like 15, 20 pounds. Like I don't know what I thought I was training for, but you just kind of get used to it. And then when I became a mom, it became another bag, right? Diapers and bottles and things and changes of clothes. And it's just, so for basically all of my adult life, I've had this really, really heavy bag. And I remember like dealing with a lot of neck pain and strain and back pain. And the doctor was like, so you know this is because the bag is too heavy. And it was like a revelation. It was the simplest thing in the world. And yet I was like, oh, must be it. So I use it as example to say, like, we are carrying around burdens and those burdens harm us and those burdens can wound us. And sometimes we don't even know how heavy the burdens we are carrying until we are actually rid of them. Like, I didn't realize how much pain and discomfort I was in. I just took that for granted. It's just like, oh, well, you're getting older, your back hurts. What can you do about it? Instead of saying, actually, there are solutions to this. And so in a world in which some people are disproportionately carrying burdens, they're carrying around this heavy load. How do we get them to surrender, right? And so I'm a daughter of the church, and I grew up with church hymns, and so I surrender all was, one of the hymns of my tradition, and we would sing all to Jesus, I surrender. But I said, what we actually do is we surrender in that moment and we pick it up almost as soon as we walk out the door. And that's what I was doing with my bag, right? I would put it down, feel fine, then pick it back up. I'm like, oh, it's so heavy. I wonder where my back is hurting. We're called to sort of a radical surrender, which is a humility. It's an acknowledgement of there are things I can change and I can work towards and I can work on, and there are some things that I cannot. It's for me prophetically. Of course, I wrote this and then, it's published months later, but it's prophetically, for the people who are struggling with everything that's happening in our world today. It feels like a lot of chaos, particularly the last couple of months. And I'm encouraging people, do the work that you can do. And if there is work you cannot do, it's okay to say, I have to surrender that. I have to yield that, right? Because we will become so overburdened reacting to every little thing. Every day I wake up and like, what new fresh thing will greet me? What new chaos? And to say, what can I take on to care for the people, to care for my neighbors, to love, to be literally the gospel? And what things do I have to release and let go of for my own survival? And so that's the story of my heavy bag. I've pared it down now. I've pared it down to a little cute bag.
Good, good.
I've gotten better.
Uh, in another chapter, you talk about the huge negative impact on generational wealth just from the black GIs, 1.2 million black GIs being shut out of the post-World War II GI Bill benefits. And how now, 80 years later, in your words, you're the first generation of your family to crawl out of poverty. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. This is my desire always to weave in the history with the theology, because actually this is what sacred scripture is. If we look at sacred scripture, if we look at the Bible, if we look at those texts that we hold to be sacred, they're history. They're history of a distinct people in a distinct place and time. So I'm sharing the story of the World War II Black veterans who came back after being drafted, most of them, and some volunteered, right? This war fighting for freedom and democracy. And the GI Bill, which was probably the largest, most important infusion of cash into the American economy, which created the very notion of the middle class. Like that actually didn't even exist before the GI
Uh,
Bill. And so the GI Bill said to returning veterans, we will help you get an education. We will help you get home loans. We will help you reintegrate back into society to thank you, right, for your service. The problem was that the GI Bill was administered at the state level. instead of it being administered at the federal level. So those veterans in Mississippi or Arkansas or Tennessee went back to Jim and Jane Crow. They went back to the same structures and restrictions of segregation that they had left before they fought in the war. And so then they couldn't get the home loans and they weren't able to access the GI Bill for education. And so many of them went back into the poverty and the sharecropping that they had known prior to that. What happened, right? Those families who accessed the GI Bill became middle class, maybe a generation later could use that home and take out a second mortgage and send their children to college. And then their grandchildren became a second and third and fourth generation of educated Americans. For most Black Americans, that did not happen. And so I didn't learn until after my grandfather's death that he had been a veteran. I didn't know that. He never talked about his military service. I could have put it together, I guess, maybe earlier if I thought about sort of his age and how old he was when the Second World War happened, but I never put it together and we only found out about it later, but never accessed the GI Bill, never was able to integrate into sort of the American middle class. Having been raised by my grandparents, neither one of whom ever finished high school. I was the first generation to go to college and the first generation to really be like fully middle class, right? What that means is that I don't have three and four generations of family history. We're talking right now in this moment about the baby boom transfer of wealth, which is going to be the largest transfer of wealth that this nation has seen. But for most Black Americans, the baby boomers never actually achieved that
Right.
status of wealth. And so
Right.
we will not be inheritors of this great transmission that is actually taking place right now.
Mhm, mhm.
It's a part of our nation's story. That's what I mean about
Absolutely.
me.
Absolutely. And, it's been ignored and shoved under the carpet for too long. So recently I had the pleasure of speaking with another friend of ours, Catherine Meeks, and the wonderful Catherine Meeks. And I told her that, given the recent dramatic change in our government, um, us white folks have even more to learn from Black people about how to survive in a resistance mode. So what advice can you give us along those lines?
So it has been a wild ride and it's only been 2 months.
Yeah.
We are all thinking through a lot of complicated scenarios, but the ability to both survive and then I want to add also find places of joy and places to thrive is a matter of resistance that Black folks in this country have known really well. Some of it is about the ability to take something to make something from nothing, right? Like to take the scraps, to take the little bits and pieces. This is what quilters do, for example, right? They take the little scraps of fabric from this and that, and then they create a thing of beauty. And so I'm thinking about these strategies, the creation of something from nothing, the willingness to work with the scraps, the willingness to take seriously the ability of the land to provide. And so I share the story of my great aunts and her generation and their knowledge of folk medicine and their knowledge of healing, like actual healing. And to simply say that I need that now. Whatever we will be facing over the course of the next few years, that kind of knowledge that comes from indigenous people or poor folk or folks who are rural and live very close to the land, we really need that. And instead of discarding people and discarding their stories and sort of just dismissing that as, as I did growing up, like that's some crazy folk medicine. Like, I don't know, like, why are they giving us castor oil? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Cod liver oil, like this was insane to me. But what I recognized was here were people who didn't really regularly have access. And so what they had to do was figure out ways to keep their communities and their families healthy and whole. Here were people who depended upon their faith to bring them joy in places where there was so little joy. So we have some lessons that we can learn about not only the possibility of survival, but the possibility of even finding joy and community in solidarity as we're going through some tough times, and I think some tougher ones even ahead of
Yeah.
us.
Yes, I agree. So we've talked about quite a few heavy, depressing topics. Can you offer us some words of hope?
Yes. So believe it or not, I mean, this is a really, really hopeful text. And a part of why it's hopeful has to do with my own location as a dean and as a professor at a divinity school. So day in and day out, I see students, I see young people, I see folks who are still believing that they can make a difference in the world. And so I want to say that on any given day, I am so hopeful because I have a whole school filled with students who remind me that there's hope. But in the context of the book, what I think I'm reminded of, which gives me hope, is that we get to write and we get to speak our way into history by sharing some of these stories, and they connect us with each other's humanity. So I come from a holiness Pentecostal background. And so the day of Pentecost is a very, very big deal in my tradition. And so we're constantly talking about this story, the day of Pentecost and cloven fire and tongues. And so we love all of that. But what I love about that story is that every person who is visiting Jerusalem hears the Spirit of God in their own language. Not that they are miraculously hearing it all in one language, all in Aramaic or all in Greek or all in, right? They are actually hearing it in their own language. And so we understand that in Jerusalem at this time, there would have been Ethiopians, there would have been people who spoke Yes, there would have been people speaking Aramaic, there would have been people, of course, speaking Hebrew and Greek and what. And so the miracle and the hope is that I get to be in the fullness of my identity, who God has made me to be, and you get to be in the fullness of your identity and who God has made you to be, and we get to be in community with one another without having to give up any of that. And so I have a lot of hope in that. I have a lot of hope in the ability to sing in my songs in my own native tongue, to speak Black church, and also to be in community and fellowship and in the body of believers with others who don't come from that tradition. And that just gives me a profound sense of hope that God never requires me to give up on who I am in order to be in community with someone else.
Well, that's just one of the many ways that you're a role model for us, Yolanda. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
What would you most like readers to take away from your book?
So I hope with this book and the last one and my other writings and a book to come after this one is that theology can be accessible. I mean, when you're trained in the academy and you go to graduate school and you get a PhD, sort of part of what you learn is you're often talking to each other, right? So theologians are talking to other theologians. Right? I have a very different calling on my life. And so I feel very called and compelled to write theology that is accessible to whosoever will. And so for me, writing this book about the wounds and thinking about how we do God's justice in the world through memory, through stories, right, is a way to make theology accessible to those who will never go to graduate school, will never, get an MDiv or a PhD, but who care very deeply about their faith. So that's the takeaway for me is to say that this is accessible for the reader, and I hope they find pieces where they identify, where their story connects with my story. That is the exciting part as I travel and I talk about the work when people tell me their stories and we realize we have so much more in common than that, which makes us different.
Well, I hope that people got a sense from our discussion about how compelling, some of the different chapters and things are that you write about in the book. I can't emphasize that enough.
Oh, thank you.
But you also are leading me into my next question was, is there anything else on the horizon that you can talk about, even though this book is, just out, but
Just
uh,
out brand new February of 2025. So, writers always have other things that they want to write. And I am constantly trying to balance the ability to write and sit down and do this work with my actual literal day job, which is running a school and making sure my students graduate and, making sure the curriculum is doing what it needs to do. Um, But what I do hope to continue to write about that I think the next project will look at is I love the notion of rituals and sacraments. And so I'm really invested in a sacramental theology, which sort of seems contrary to sort of what we would call like Pentecostal ecclesiology, which is often low church, right? And so for the people listening to this, right, it's not an insult. It's just talking about like how liturgical or not liturgical a particular tradition is. And so I'm really looking forward to writing about the ways in which the sacramental and the liturgical show up outside of, sort of the traditional sacraments and liturgies that form our church. So it's a project, that I'm working on somewhere between, graduating one class and a new class coming in.
Sure, sure. Well, doing that kind of juggling has got to be quite a challenge, I'm sure.
It's definitely a challenge, but it's also a joy. I love this work and I'm so very grateful to be able to do this, to have a sense of vocation and God's calling. And so it is busy, but is beautiful.
Well, it shows. It shows in a big way. So
Mhm.
again, check out the new book from Yolanda, the Wounds Are the Witness, Black Faith Weaving Memory into Justice and Healing. I'm sure you'll get a lot out of that book. And check it out at yolandapierce.com or broadleafbooks.com. Yolanda, thanks so much for joining us and many best wishes for you on all of your wonderful work.
Thank you so much for having me yet again for this book. And it's just always a pleasure to sit down and talk with you.
Thank you so much.